Hello, and welcome to a NISOD webinar. Today, we'll be discussing useful, usable, and actionable, how faculty can use data to improve student success. My name is Brad Phillips, and I direct the Institute for Evidence-Based Change, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Jordan Horowitz, who is the Chief Operating Officer of IEBC. So at IEBC, we always start with an exercise whenever we're doing a presentation. And so I'd like all of you in attendance to take a moment and think about how data is part of your everyday life. And I know if you're not a data person, it's kind of hard to think about this, but the reality is we are surrounded by data that influences our life. So if you're having trouble thinking about it, as you can see on the screen, the very first item impacts our life in so many ways, our credit score. And if you know anything about credit scores, an 808 out of 850 is a really good credit score. Now, I want you to think about this young person who just got her driver's license and how important it is to have that document to be able to say, now I'm legally able to drive. That's a piece of data, that's a piece of evidence that shows that someone's able to do something. And finally, unfortunately, in the United States, we are constantly concerned about our weight. So I don't know about you, but every morning I check my weight on the scale, and my wife and I have wonderful conversations and sometimes arguments about who's losing weight faster or slower. Now, the question to you is, what data is important to you in your life, personally and professionally, and how are you using that data to make judgments for decision-making, for aspects of your life where you use that data to help you improve your life? Next slide. Now, what we're going to talk about today is IEBC's really unique model of data use. And in fact, this model is so unique that Harvard Education Press invited Jordan and myself to write a book on this. And in 2017, we wrote a book on creating a data-informed culture in community colleges. So much of what we're talking about today is actually in that publication. So I invite you to take a look and see what you think. So when we think about IEBC's unique data use model, one of the things that we focus on is why data use is important. You know, we exist in what we often call data-rich and information-poor organizations. There's tons of data in your community college where you can have access to all sorts of kinds of things. But the question is, what data is really important for decision-making? Now, today we're going to focus on a specific aspect of the work that we do. And that is, we're going to provide today 5 evidence-based tips for making data useful, usable, and actionable. And what do we mean by that? When we think about data being useful, it's data that you can actually use in your everyday lives at your institution. You know, there's so much data out there, but how much of that data is applicable to you? We also want to talk to you about making that data usable. So oftentimes you'll see data, and even Jordan and I will get data from all across the country asking for our help in making that data usable. And we look at that data and we scratch our heads and we go, I have no idea what this data means. And so one of the things we talk a great deal about is how do we make that data usable so that it's understandable? And then finally, and quite frankly, the most important aspect of these 5 evidence-based tips is using that data to make decisions. How often do you receive data that is something that's nice to know, but not necessarily set up so that you can make decisions? Next slide. So what does our model look like? The first part of our model, and you think of three legs of a stool, right? And all of these three legs are focused on improving student success. And while we're not naive in saying, well, data is the only thing you need for student success, that's not true. There's all sorts of other things. But the reality is data helps ground our decision-making. So when we think about improving student success, the first thing we want to think about is the analytics part. That is, how does that data get into the system? What's the quality of that data? How does that data get out of the system? And you may not know this, but the federal government has actually done studies about data quality. And what they say basically is getting data into and out of a system is probably 80 to 90% of the battle, that it's not so easy to do. So oftentimes as faculty, we may be requesting data and we're wondering, why does it take so long to get that data back? That's because that data may not be easily available. It may not be able to be put in a format that's easily usable or actionable. And so a lot of time goes into making sure that data is of high quality and can be used. In terms of the next leg of our stool, we call this human judgment and decision-making. As you're listening to me, believe it or not, you cannot turn off your judgment-making in your brain. It's part of how our brains work. And a little side note, Jordan and I are both former shrinks. We both saw patients for years before we got into education. And now we are in this wonderful world of education, and personally for me, for the last 31 years. So our brains can't turn off our judgments. You are making judgments about what I'm saying. But the key here is not just making the judgments, but rather using those judgments to make good decisions about practice, how we are engaging with our own work, with our students, with our institution in general. And then finally, organizational habits. You know, every organization has particular habits. And I want you to just think for a minute, does your community college have any habits that you just don't understand why your college does what it does? And let me tell you a little secret. Organizational habits come from human habits, right? Organizations are made out of human beings. And we often have habits that have just been around forever that may have worked great at the time, but absolutely make no sense today. Let me give you a wonderful story on this. I have a good friend who's a president of a community college in California who told me a story of a young man who was trying to get his parking permit. Because if you are based in California, you know everything costs money and parking costs money because it's so hard to get. So this young man, not only did he have a difficulty even getting to where he had to get his permit, which happened to be at the police department, which is not a good message to begin with, but he had to go down the hill to get his parking permit. It was the spring semester. He'd already been a student in fall. He walks up to the police counter and the person behind the counter says, "I can't give you your permit because you owe $1. So some department wanted $1. So he said, well, let me just pay you the $1. And the person behind the counter said, can't do that. It's not my department. You don't owe us $1 at the police department. He says, well, who do I owe it to? She says, well, our system doesn't tell us that. So here's this poor young man trying to simply park his truck. He can't now park at the institution, even though in the first 2 weeks parking is free. So he's very upset. So he goes home and he doesn't dare tell his father. He tells his mother. And his mother got very upset at this. She says, what do you mean you can't park here? What do you mean they won't tell you who you owe the $1 to? So what happens is mom gets upset and she tells dad. Well, guess who dad is? Dad's the president of the college, my friend. So he walks down to the police department and says, what's going on here? What are we doing to students? Well, we've always collected this money through the police department. Students always have to finalize their fees. He says, well, wait a minute here. This is a full-time student. We get so many thousands of dollars for this person being a student, and this person won't be a student if they can't park their car at the institution. So we have these embedded habits on our institutions. And then he said, well, I'm moving everything to the bursar's office. And I said, I'll call him Steve. Steve, we have a long-term habit of naming our cashier's office, the Berkshire's office, but the Berkshire's office went out with Ben Franklin. Let's name this the cashier's office. That way everyone knows where to pay their fees. What a surprise. Next slide, please. Now, when we talk about data use, you've often heard the expression, we are a data-driven institution. Well, I hate to tell you this, but Jordan and I, as experts in this field, we don't believe in that phrase, data-driven, because unfortunately, data doesn't always drive behavior. Data doesn't always drive decision-making. In fact, when we think about data, what we're really talking is informing decision-making, because you know what? Anytime decisions are influenced or informed by data, they're looking at not only the data, but politics. Our institutions are very political organizations. We have deep histories. There may be financial issues that are part of this. And so we can't truly say that we are a data-driven institution, but we can say we are data-informed, or we like to often say the data is used as a reference to help us make a decision. Next slide, please. Now, we really like Edward Deming, and you may know Edward Deming from his work in Japan and all of the great work that he has done. But what Edward Deming says, and we love this quote, is without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And so in our educational institutions, we know that there are lots of individuals that we deal with that have strong opinions about things. But the reality is these opinions need to be backed up with evidence, and that evidence is through the data. Now, let's talk about some challenges to using data through what we call the 4 villains of data use. And so it's important as we think about human judgment decision-making to really understand these, what we call biases. And there are literally a couple hundred different biases in the literature. But the Heath brothers, who wrote a very famous book on this, talk about these 4 biases that are so important. The first one is called confirmation bias. Have you ever been in a meeting where people use data to confirm their beliefs? That is, this is the evidence, and we gather that evidence simply around how we're confirming our opinion about what we think is happening in the world or what should be done. You know, it's really important to look at data from multiple perspectives, to not only collect quantitative information, but also qualitative information to help us understand not just what's going on, but why it's happening. The second bias is known as narrow focus. And what's meant by that is sometimes when we're thinking about a particular area of interest, we will only focus on one small aspect of that area. So it's really important that we don't overlook other kinds of data. Think and rather than or when we're looking at data. So it's not just one simple small focus using one number, but rather using multiple points of data and multiple perspectives. The third form of bias is what we call short-term emotional interference. You know, a lot of things happen on college campuses. Right now, we're in the world of COVID, and maybe there's a COVID case that's happening with our students who are coming back on campus. And what do? We shut down the entire institution. Maybe that's the appropriate thing to do. Everyone's very emotional about this and totally understandably emotional about this. But maybe what we need to do is take a step back and say, okay, tabula rasa, right? Blank slate. Let's take a look at this. Let's look at how this case happened. Let's figure out if this is something that is endemic to our institution or an isolated incident. Because what happens is when we're emotional, we tend to shut down and not focus on the big picture. Finally, an important bias that we use in our data use work is overconfidence. Have you ever been in meetings where there's one person that simply knows everything and they are using this data to help prove that they really know everything and they're so confident about it and they won't even accept maybe alternative data, real data, facts, but data about maybe looking at the phenomena of interest in a slightly different way. So it's really important when we think about that, it's really important to look at context. It's really important to look at the whole picture, not just a particular slice of it that is help supporting that particular person's claim. Now, data also helps us get to consensus. Now, at IEBC, we love templates. We are just template lovers, and we feel that templates really help frame the work that we do and help people really engage with the data. And one of our templates has the following items to help us get to consensus. The first thing that happens whenever any new data is presented is the idea of, boy, is this information accurate? Because we all know when data is presented, if that data is not accurate, what happens to the rest of the presentation? It's not believed. So the first part is data always has to be as accurate as possible, knowing there are caveats to every piece of data, but making sure that that data is as accurate as possible. The second thing that happens is we have what we call, and our old professor at Claremont Graduate University, Dale Berger, used to say, the interocular trauma test. So we look at this data and we go, what's jumping out at us? What's happening? Why? Are there themes to this data that help us understand the phenomenon of interest? Now, another one that we love is when we look at data and it helps us get over the biases is, does this information challenge our current assumptions about a particular population? You know, we may have certain feelings about how a particular group is doing, whether that's on course retention, course success, showing up for class, whatever it is. But when we look at data, we have to ask ourselves, is this data in alignment with what we've heard before and what we understand? Or does this data challenge some current assumptions about what we believe we know? Then we want to take a step back and say, okay, in thinking about this data and getting to the why questions, what might be contributing to these students' success, their outcomes? And also, what do you think might be detracting from their success? And sometimes that data is not obvious. I remember when I taught, I used to have some students always come in late, right? 15 minutes late, used to drive me crazy. And then finally I said, okay, well, what's going on with these students? I don't know. I'm going to ask them. So I simply asked them, and it turns out the bus route from their house was always late getting them to the institution. Finally, when we think about data, we always have to ask ourselves, is this data that we need to make a decision about policy or practice? In other words, is this the right data? Is it aligned with what we need? What's the most important information? And then finally, what's missing? But just a caveat in terms of what's missing. Sometimes what happens is you have some colleagues that never have enough data to make a decision. So one has to ask themselves, how much information is enough to make a decision about policy or practice? With that, I'd like us to get to our main focus today, which is our 5 tips. And Jordan, would you like to get us started?
Thanks, Fred. Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you all. So I'm going to start us off on our 5 tips. The first tip, and very important tip, is focus. What do we mean by that? I imagine you have all seen and received something that looks like this. This is like playing Where's Waldo? What is the story here? What is the theme here? How can I make sense of this? It's absurd. So all these rows, over a dozen rows, and all these columns. And if you look at the title, this is only for first-time in college students. You know that you're going to turn the page and there's going to be a page for all students. There's going to be a page broken out by ethnicity. There's going to be a page broken out by gender. It's going to be endless. And this is not useful. This is not usable. And it certainly isn't actionable. So how do we focus in? We need to start by asking some questions. First of all, who is the audience? Who is going to be using and receiving this data? And in that way, we can limit, and we'll talk about how to limit it shortly. We'll be able to limit the data that we provide and be able to tell a story that becomes actionable. And then what is the one point you want the group to focus on. We really discourage examining multiple points of data, more than maybe 2 or 3, and also knowing what is the key point I want my group to focus on. Are we going to be looking at course retention and success? Are we going to be looking at term-to-term persistence and year-to-year retention? Are we going to be looking at completion and transfer rates? And what is the point that I want my group to focus on, and that is driven by the audience? And then you want your group to focus as well. And for that, we like to use a priming activity. We opened this session with a priming activity. Brad's question about the data you have in your life and that you use gets your heads into the space of data. We're going to be talking about data, thinking about data. And a great priming activity is before you even hand out the data, ask the group, what do you think about this? Before I hand out any data, what's your perspective on course retention and success in your courses? Who succeeds? Why do you think they succeed? Who tends to advance to the next course in your sequence? Just get some thoughts and opinions before you even hand out the data, and that will keep people focused and help you get to the point. You don't need more than this to get the conversation going. Black and Latinx students have lower average course success rates than white and Asian students. And you can see this is across 3 terms. And here are the average course success rates for the 3 groups. Your Black or African American students, your Latinx students, your white or Caucasian students, and your Asian students. And of course, you can have more categories, as relevant for your college. But this is all you need to see to get the conversation going. And you can see we use personas. We recommend using pictures of students. Part of the neurobiology that we studied that helps us understand human judgment and decision making is, as human beings, we focus on other human faces. Take advantage of that. Use it to your advantage. Create personas. The second tip is to know your leading and lagging indicators. Our data use model is grounded in leading and lagging indicators. So what do we mean by that? Leading indicators are in your control and lead to your hoped for success. Lagging indicators are affected by what you do to influence your leading indicators. Now, unfortunately, we tend to be held accountable for our lagging indicators. Legislatures, our boards, our public, they hold us accountable for our completion rates, our transfer rates, are our students being employed in their field at a living wage. But these are outside of our control. They're measured on students once they leave. So we need to ask what leading indicators that are within our control lead to this success. And we have a leading and lagging pyramid. At the base of the pyramid are leading indicators, and you can move up the pyramid towards your ultimate lagging indicators. And you can see you have a lot more control over what's at the bottom: students' enrollment, retention in class, successful course grades. These are all things that we can control. We can provide student support services, interventions. We can do better outreach to increase the potential students, to get them connected with our students. We can use various structures, such as the Guided Pathways program that's being implemented in so many colleges, to make sure students are enrolled in classes and enrolled in the right classes. But as we move up this pyramid, ultimately we have less and less control until we get to completion. For this pyramid, we can add levels throughout. In fact, we've often added at the top, beyond completion, employment. At the top, we have very little direct control. And as I mentioned, it's measured on students who've already left our institution. For faculty, Your leading indicators are things such as attendance, your assignments, your assessments. These are things that you have control over that allow you to intervene with students early on. You want assessments that are early and often. We've worked with colleges, the first assessment some faculty gave was the midterm, and it occurs after the drop date. That does not give students and you any information along the way about how well your students are doing, so you can provide the necessary supports, they can request the necessary interventions, and so on. So attendance, assignments, and assessments just happen to all begin with A, are our leading indicators as faculty, and our lagging indicators, which if we take care of those, are course retention. We know that if a student isn't showing up in the first few weeks, we reach out to them and contact them and figure out why. If a student isn't doing well, and we know, this is a student who's likely to drop, we provide some interventions. We connect with them. We ask them what's going on. So course retention, course success, persistence to the next course in the sequence, or persistence to the next term, are all lagging indicators that, taking care of our leading indicators as faculty, we can take care of and know. And then if we look at our pyramid and go beyond our personal lagging indicators, we can get to year-to-year retention and completion. Our third tip, and Brad touched on this briefly during his introduction, is that data must be useful, usable, and actionable. Let's go a little deeper into these. For something to be useful for us as faculty and college employees, leadership, even staff, it has to be a link in the chain of student success. That makes something useful because it helps us understand what makes students, what supports students succeed and not. We do not believe in providing anything for information only. If something is on an agenda for information only, that message that gets sent is, it's time to check my cell phone. Why am I being told this? It has no use. I'm sitting in this meeting, it's taking up my time. Make sure things are useful. To be usable, things must be clear. They must be easily understood. Things must also be simple. As simplicity goes up, so does the effectiveness of the data you're presenting. And finally, actionable. Nothing should lead to a dead-end conversation. To be actionable, it should help us answer the question, are we being effective in our student success efforts? Knowing that what we are doing is effective or not effective can lead to action. Are we going to keep this intervention around? Are we going to modify it? Is it only reaching certain populations? Or should we be dropping it completely? That's what makes things actionable. It leads to improved effectiveness in our student success efforts. We also need to disaggregate for action. And I'm pretty confident that your data gets disaggregated by certain kind of classic groups, first time in college students, ethnicity, because it's a focus right now, and also a focus for funding efforts and so on, gender. There are many ways we disaggregate among student populations, but we also encourage disaggregation to figure out when do groups of students systematically underperform, leave, or fail. This will help us target our actions. And disaggregate by course or course sequence. Are there courses or sequences that are particularly telling? We tend to label gateway courses because of when they fall in the course sequence. But there are gateway courses can also be those courses that differentiate students who go on to major, who move through the course sequences, and so on. So we need to disaggregate beyond our student demographic items. Our fourth tip is to capitalize on what we know about how human beings process information. We read, as we were developing our data use model, we read an amazing book called Descartes Error by Antonio Damasio at the University of Southern California. And he goes back and makes an extremely convincing case, and he is a neurobiologist, that the big idea that emotion and intellect can't be separated is nonsense. And this is what Brad alluded to early on when he was talking about human judgment and decision making. So how do we take advantage of the fact that they are deeply interconnected, biologically interconnected, emotionally interconnected, intellectually interconnected? So one of the things we can do is to make our tables explicit. And this gets to telling the story. Here is a table. We've introduced an intervention that's designed to increase enrollment in science courses. And here is a table. This is a very typical table, typical title. It describes what's going on. Here is science course enrollment by ethnicity and gender. But I'm pretty confident you will look at this table and not be able to figure out what's going on. Who is this working for? What is the impact of this program designed to improve science course enrollment? But what if I do this? What if I title my table for what I want people to notice? And I can even highlight the row. Latina students demonstrate increased chemistry enrollment. And all of a sudden it jumps out at me, look at that. My female Hispanic Latino students are the only ones who showed an increase in enrollment every year since this program was implemented. So this tells me so much. If I want to get students in any other group to improve their enrollment in chemistry, I need to look for some other type of support or intervention. I can target this group of students with this intervention. And so make it obvious. People shouldn't have to go searching, even though this isn't like that first table with Where's Waldo, it helps to make it explicit. Let's look at another example. Student success metrics. Yes, that's what this is a table of. These are student success metrics broken down by some key student groups. But what's the story here? But if I change my title and highlight a line, all of a sudden I realize, look at this. My science, technology, engineering, and math students, my STEM students, are outperforming other student groups on these metrics. Again, this helps me to focus my interventions to understand what's happening. It's disaggregation and it is explicit. I don't need to take 15 minutes in my meeting for people to look at this and have conversations about, well, it looks like this, it looks like that. Also, turn numbers into students. Only 10% of our first time in college students don't persist after their first year. In the current academic climate, this is a rate most colleges would consider an exemplary goal. But in a college with 800 first time in college students, this is 80 students. And what we like to do is tell people, imagine 80 students gathered outside your window. Look at those faces, look at those students. Can we really afford to fail these students, 80 students? Yes, that's only 10%. But when you look at those students and turn numbers into students, the impact, the motivation for action becomes far greater. And now I'm going to turn it back to Brad for our fifth tip and some closing remarks.
Thank you, Jordan. So part of our work is we do workshops around the kinds of things that Jordan talked about with the 4 tips and this 5th tip, telling your story. And I'm always the one that does the telling the story workshop, almost always, because I love this particular workshop. So I want you to sit back and think for a minute about your favorite story. What kinds of stories do you find memorable, impactful, and personal? We all have favorite stories. Maybe it's a hero story. Maybe it's a underdog story. Maybe it's a romantic story, but there's always a story or a theme or a genre that we like best. And why? Because it's memorable, impactful, and personal. Now, every story begins with a headline. Now, those of us that still read newspapers, maybe if you're being honest with yourselves, you read the headlines for a lot of the paper and then maybe the first line or so. But take a look at these. Headline, state population to double by 2040, babies to blame. That's a great headline. Second one, man accused of killing lawyer receives a new attorney. I'd hate to be that new attorney. Third one, parents keep kids home to protest school closure. Talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then finally, city council runs out of time to discuss shorter meetings. I know that this is Jordan's favorite headline. But as you can see, when we think about the last tip that Jordan talked about, where we've changed that title to talk about that table or chart, the headline is so critical. It shouldn't just say enrollment over time or student retention outcomes by semester. The actual information in the table needs to be analyzed so that that headline begins the discussion. But then the question is, okay, how do we tell that story? Well, we love to refer to the house that the mouse built, Disney. And Disney not only does theme parks, not only does movies and shows, but they also help organizations with how they organize their environments. And so one of the things that we love about Disney is looking at how they are the best storytellers, and they do it a very specific way. The first thing they do is they set the context. How do they do that? Once upon a time in a land far, far away, right? They couldn't do Star Wars before, but now Disney owns Star Wars. Then the next thing they do is they outline the problem. Okay, the princess was expelled from the castle or whatever it is. So there's some challenge. Then the issue is, well, what happened to resolve that problem? And then finally, the outcomes in the old Disney was they lived happily ever after, which isn't always the case. But what does that now look like if we were to take Disney's way to tell the story and apply it to your college? So let's walk through each one of these. The first, as we said, was context. In the Disney world, they would say, once upon a time in a land far, far away. Your college might say, our institution has a population that is under 40% under the age of 20 and growing. That means a lot of new first-time students right out of high school. What's our problem from the Disney standpoint? There was a young girl who lived in misery with her evil stepmother and stepsisters. From our perspective, the completion rate for our 20 and under students is half of the completion rate for the over 20 population. All right, we have an increased number of students that are under 20 and they're not doing well. What's the resolution? From the Disney standpoint, she married a prince. It was very misogynistic in the old days of Disney. And then from our perspective, what did we do? Well, we wanted to fix this problem. Our under 20-year-olds are not doing well. So we piloted a support program with peer mentoring, and the rate increased to almost that of over 20 years old student population for students in the pilot program. So by mentoring, we were able to increase the completion rate. So the outcomes, Disney side, she lived happily ever after. From our side, the program is being expanded and institutionalized. It's going to scale, and we will continue to monitor that impact. Now, it's really important that when we think about storytelling, we understand that there are different ways to say the same thing. For example, the statement, the odds of survival 1 month after surgery are 90%. Now that's not bad, 90%, right? It's a major surgery, but it's much more reassuring to say that than the equivalent statement, 1 in 10 die within 1 month of surgery. Now, which one would you rather hear going into surgery? Another item. Similarly, cold cuts described as 90% fat-free are more appetizing than when they are described as 10% fat. So you see the difference? You know, we often present data in a negative way, but we like to start with the positive, and we'll tell you why in this next slide. So as we think about framing, there are times to tell a positive story and times to tell a story where there's a challenge to overcome. When we think about telling a positive story, the key is specifically to highlight what made a difference in whatever you did to change the outcome. What was that key element or elements that made that difference? So when you're telling a positive story about something that went well, you're really asking the audience to do this same behavior. You're trying to motivate them to do that behavior. Now, conversely, when you are telling a story where there's a problem, right? There's some challenge, we're not doing well in this or that. You want to describe the problem and why it matters, because the important part about this is you want people to connect with why it's a problem. And then you want to focus on, well, what's the underlying, what are the root causes, and what we as educators can do about addressing the challenge. It's really important to understand that as educators, we are life-changing people. We help people improve their lives, and we can and do make a difference in thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of students' lives. And in order to help people address that challenge, it's important not just to say it's a problem and I'm not sure how to fix it, but rather to say, look, we've done some research. Here are what other colleges are doing to address these challenges, and here's how these challenges can be overcome. We can, in fact, make a difference, and here's how we'd like to do that. So these are the 5 tips. We hope that these tips have been helpful to you as a bit of a big toe in the water to understand how you can make a difference in making data useful, usable, and actionable, and actually change the paradigm about how data is engaged with at your institution.
So let's take a moment and review the 5 tips. Tip number 1 is focus. I was working with a college and I was sitting down with the institutional researcher and the president and the VP for instruction. They were all so proud. They showed me a binder, a 3-inch binder full of tables. And they were so proud that every department chair got this binder every semester of the data for all the courses and all their faculty members in their department. And I asked them, and how do you suppose these department heads use this data and use this binder? And they thought for a minute, and I could see the 3 light bulbs come on. The room got a lot brighter. All of a sudden, they all realized it. And the president says, they probably use it to hold their door open or prop up a corner of a table that's too short. And they realized at that moment the importance of focusing the data, because overwhelming people with data becomes where's Waldo, and they just make no use of it at all.
As you may recall, leading and lagging is all about having control, having influence over the areas for which we have control. And I remember so clearly a frantic phone call from a colleague of mine who was a vice president of instruction. And he said to me, Brad, I don't understand it. I'm having such trouble getting faculty to look at and engage with data on completion, degrees, certificates, and transfer. And I said to him, in all seriousness, why do they care? They can't control completion. The best that they could do is help students be successful in their classes, but they can't possibly influence completion of degrees, certificates, and transfer.
Our third tip was to ensure things are useful, usable, and actionable. I was working with a college here in Southern California just recently who were struggling with all the information they had around equity issues. And what we finally decided on was which of these student metrics, which pieces of information are useful, usable, and actionable to different groups on campus. And in that way, they were able to present student metrics that were relevant to the different groups they were working with and ensure that they could have some impact on their equity.
When we think about capitalizing on how human beings process information, what we're really focusing on is helping make that information very explicit. So we're pointing our colleagues into a direction so that we are engaging with the data. And I have to tell you, of all the tips, this particular tip has made the most difference with our institutional research colleagues. I mean, think about it. They're trained to make tables the way Jordan displayed in the Where's Waldo. In other words, more information, good. But the reality is it's not good. We want people to have good, thoughtful conversations around a piece of data so that decisions can be made. And so it's really critical. And I have to tell you, difficult in when we work with our institutional research colleagues, and my joke is always IR1, those of you in institutional research understand exactly what I'm saying, know how difficult it is to do that because look, we have to move our institutional research colleagues away from being data jockeys to analysts, and then helping experts use that data for decision making. And then finally, of course, my favorite is telling a story. This work has really transformed institutions. I want you to think about the last data presentation that you were involved in and what happened. Maybe it was part of a meeting where data was presented on an issue, it was part of the agenda, and then what happened? Okay, it's time for the next item, and all conversation was closed off. When you tell a story, folks don't necessarily remember the actual numbers, but the reality is they remember how they feel. And when you tap into feelings, that's when you get good, thoughtful conversations about the data. And it also, in storytelling, provides insights into not just what the data is telling you, but why the phenomenon of interest is occurring. I'd like to move on to one other issue before we close. We believe that faculty should not just be receiving data. We believe that faculty should be active in presenting that data, becoming data experts, and we believe in a faculty data coaching model where faculty are colleague to colleague, helping one another understand their own data. Look, you know, we never want an administrator telling us what to do as a faculty member, right? We want to work with our colleagues to understand a phenomenon of interest through data and work together to make a difference. And so the idea behind faculty data coaching is really developing processes and practices, procedures for faculty to work with one another, usually in a department level, to look at data and review action plans about how we're going to make a difference. And I'm not just talking program review that occurs every 3 to 5 years. I'm talking about a recursive model that looks at improvement on a regular basis. And the idea behind this is that the faculty data coach would be hand in hand working with the institutional research, institutional effectiveness office to help gather the data that matters to faculty, and then using that data from a faculty to faculty perspective to come to some decisions about using that information to make a difference in practice. So with that, I'd like to just share our information. If you'd like to contact us, please feel free to email us at info@iebc.org. Our website, you'll see a lot of information on data use, including videos, including a very similar 5 tips webinar. Here is our general phone number if you'd like to schedule an appointment to chat with us. And we want to thank you so much for your time in spending with us on this 5 tips webinar. And please feel free to contact us anytime. Both Jordan and I are on the West Coast. And with that, we have some time for questions, and we will open that up when we are live. So thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you all very much.